Imagine a country so enormous that while people on one side were eating breakfast, people on the other were already getting ready for bed. A country that covered roughly 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, 15 republics, 11 time zones, almost 290 million people, millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and at one point, around 45,000 nuclear warheads. All of it belonged to one country, the Soviet Union. And if you grew up after the Cold War, there's a pretty obvious question. Why were the United States so afraid of it? Seriously, America was richer. It had aircraft carriers, the world's largest economy, and allies all over the planet. America literally put people on the moon. So why, for almost half of the 20th century, did one of America's biggest political concerns basically sound like this? What are the Russians doing now? And that isn't even the strangest part. The strangest part is how it all ended, because a country that spent decades preparing to survive a nuclear war didn't survive 1991. So today, we're going to find out just how terrifying the Soviet Union really was, what exactly the Americans were afraid of, and how one of the world's two superpowers somehow disappeared right in front of everyone. First, we need to understand the scale, because today we look at a map and see Russia. Big, very big, ridiculously big. But the Soviet Union was even bigger. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, Central Asia, 15 republics in total. Its territory covered roughly 22 million square kilometers. For comparison, that's basically the United States, plus Canada, plus a little extra space, because apparently that still wasn't enough. And geography was only the beginning. By the end of the Cold War, the Soviet armed forces had more than 4 million active personnel. And these weren't 4 million people occasionally showing up for military training. This was an enormous, permanent war machine. Tank armies, aircraft, submarines, ballistic missiles, military bases, satellites, and of course, nuclear weapons. A lot of nuclear weapons. According to estimates, the Soviet nuclear arsenal reached its peak around 1986, about 45,000 warheads. 45,000. At that point, the word overkill basically stops meaning anything. Of course, not every single one of those warheads could immediately be launched at New York. There were different types of weapons, different yields, and different delivery systems. But America had a different problem. The Soviet Union didn't need the ability to destroy every American city. It only needed to guarantee that it could inflict unacceptable damage on the United States in retaliation, even if America attacked first. And the Soviet Union achieved exactly that. Missiles buried in underground silos, strategic bombers, nuclear submarines capable of spending months hidden somewhere in the ocean. America might have been able to destroy part of the Soviet arsenal, but destroying all of it before the Soviets could respond? That was almost impossible to guarantee. And this is where the Cold War turns into one of the most insane ideas humanity has ever invented. If America attacks the Soviet Union destroys America. If the Soviet Union attacks America, America destroys the Soviet Union. So, nobody attacks anybody. Brilliant! Humanity basically invented world peace through the threat of ending the world. But there was another problem. The Soviet Union didn't exist only inside its enormous borders. After World War II, Moscow gained enormous influence across Eastern Europe. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. Most of these countries joined the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact. And this is where American and Western European generals would look at the map and start feeling slightly uncomfortable, because on the other side were the enormous ground forces of the Warsaw Pact and a truly ridiculous number of tanks. And beyond them, West Germany, France, and eventually the Atlantic Ocean. So the fear wasn't really that a Soviet tank would suddenly show up outside a supermarket in Ohio. The real problem was much more serious. The Soviet Union was the only country on Earth that could genuinely threaten the continued existence of the United States as a modern nation. But how real was that threat? And this is where things get interesting. Because it's easy to imagine the Cold War as a simple story. America on one side, the Soviet Union on the other, both sitting with their fingers above giant red buttons, waiting to see who blinked first. But reality was much more complicated. The Soviet leadership was afraid of the United States too, very afraid. For Moscow, its enormous military and its influence over Eastern Europe weren't just tools for attacking other countries. They were also a gigantic security buffer. The Soviet Union had just survived World War II, a war that had literally turned huge parts of its territory into a battlefield. So from the Soviet perspective, the logic was fairly simple. The farther any potential enemy was from Moscow, the better. The problem was that from Washington, this looked completely different. If the Soviet Union keeps establishing friendly governments farther and farther west, keeps building missiles, keeps expanding its military, and keeps supporting communist movements around the world, then where exactly does it plan to stop? Nobody really knew the answer. And communism wasn't simply a different economic system from the American point of view. It was a competing vision of how the world should work. The Soviet Union supported its allies and revolutionary movements. America supported its allies and anti-communist forces. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, the Middle East, Latin America, the two superpowers almost never fought each other directly. Instead, for decades, they fought through other people. But there was one moment when they came terrifyingly close: Cuba. An American reconnaissance aircraft discovers Soviet missile sites being constructed on the island. And here's one small geographical detail. Cuba is only about 150 kilometers from Florida. Soviet nuclear missiles were suddenly appearing right next to the American coast. Imagine Washington's reaction. It's basically like opening your curtains in the morning and discovering that your neighbor has installed a ballistic missile in his backyard and written your name on it. The Cuban Missile Crisis begins. The United States military goes to DEFCON 2. That's only one level below maximum readiness. American military leaders discuss attacking Cuba. Soviet troops are already on the island. Ships are moving across the Atlantic. And for several days, the world is basically trying to figure out whether nuclear war has started yet. Eventually, Khrushchev agrees to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba. The United States publicly promises not to invade the island, and later removes its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Everyone backs away. And at roughly the same time, both sides realize, oh my God, we almost killed everyone. After the crisis, a direct communication link was even established between the Kremlin and the White House. Because apparently managing the possible end of human civilization through slow diplomatic messages wasn't a great idea. And the Cuban Missile Crisis perfectly explains the real fear of the Soviet Union. Americans weren't afraid because they were certain the Soviets are definitely attacking tomorrow. They were afraid because if something went wrong, the cost of a mistake was almost unimaginable. An intelligence mistake, a general making the wrong decision, a computer malfunction, a misunderstood message, one person deciding that the enemy has already launched an attack. And suddenly, you might have only minutes to decide. Do you retaliate or do you wait? That's what made the Soviet Union such a terrifying opponent. Not because it was all powerful, it wasn't. The Soviet economy had enormous problems. In many areas, the United States was moving ahead technologically. The Soviet system suffered from shortages, inefficiency, bureaucracy, and enormous military spending. But it had one thing that really mattered: the ability to force America to take it seriously. Very seriously. And this is where the story becomes almost absurd. By the mid-1980s, you have a country with millions of military personnel, tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, an enormous territory, and a global network of allies. If you had told someone at the time, in a few years, this country won't even exist, they probably wouldn't have believed you. But that is exactly what happened. And there's one important thing to understand here. The Soviet Union did not collapse overnight. Looking back, the cracks had been visible for years. Economic growth was slowing. The system was incredibly bureaucratic. Military spending consumed enormous amounts of resources. The stores could look a lot less impressive than the military parades in Red Square. And this gigantic country was made up of many different republics, nationalities, and political movements whose interests didn't always match Moscow's. Then, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. And his basic idea actually sounds pretty reasonable. The system isn't working properly, so let's fix it. Perestroika, glasnost, economic reforms, more openness, less tension with the West. There was just one small problem. When a system has survived for decades through strict centralized control, carefully loosening that control can be dangerous. Gorbachev wanted to reform the Soviet Union, but those reforms started changing the very mechanisms that were holding it together. People gained more freedom to talk about the system's problems. The republics gained more political independence. And in Eastern Europe, Moscow stopped showing the same willingness to send in tanks to keep communist governments in power. And then everything starts happening incredibly fast. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. One communist government after another collapses across Eastern Europe. 1990, inside the Soviet Union itself, the republics begin demanding more sovereignty. Lithuania declares the restoration of its independence. Others begin following. And finally, 1991, August. A group of senior Soviet officials attempts a coup. They want to stop the country from falling apart and restore central control. Gorbachev is isolated. Tanks enter Moscow. And this is where Boris Yeltsin appears. He openly opposes the coup. Thousands of people take to the streets. Within days, the coup collapses, and the people who were trying to save the Soviet Union essentially accelerate its death. After August, Gorbachev's authority collapses. So does the authority of the Central Soviet government, and the republics begin leaving, one after another. Ukraine declares independence, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and the others. Now look at how fast this happened. The coup attempt begins on August 19th, and by December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus meet and declare that the Soviet Union has effectively ceased to exist. A few more weeks pass. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appears on television and announces his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. After his speech, the red Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor is raised in its place. And on December 26th, the final legal step is taken. The Soviet Union officially ceases to exist. A country with a military of more than 4 million people, thousands of tanks, nuclear submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and an enormous nuclear arsenal. It disappeared without an American invasion, without a nuclear war, without Moscow being captured. It collapsed from within. And it happened so quickly that during the Soviet Union's final months, the American government was no longer thinking only about, how do we defeat the Soviet Union? The new question was something closer to, okay, who controls all those nuclear missiles now? And maybe that gives us the best answer to our original question. Why was everyone afraid of the Soviet Union? Not because it was invincible, not because the Soviet military could conquer the entire world, and not because Soviet leaders woke up every morning thinking about how to destroy America. People were afraid because the Soviet Union possessed a combination that almost no country in history had ever possessed. Enormous territory, a gigantic military, global influence, and most importantly, the ability to inflict catastrophic damage on its enemy within hours. For decades, that was enough to make half the planet build its strategy around one question: what is Moscow going to do? But the history of the Soviet Union also left us with another, perhaps even more interesting lesson. A country can look almost unbeatable from the outside, while being surprisingly fragile on the inside. You can build tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. You can send a human being into space. You can station armies from Berlin to Vladivostok, but no missile can solve the problems of an economy, a political system, and millions of people who no longer want to live by the old rules. And that may be the strangest thing about the Soviet Union. Not how much the world once feared it, but how quickly, one day, it stopped. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm really putting a lot of effort into making these stories interesting and entertaining for you. Please subscribe There are many more exciting stories to come. Thank you so much. You're the best.